You're listening to Natural Resources University. In this podcast network, our hosts are university researchers and extension specialists, opening your gateway to the science of natural resource management.
Welcome to Fire University. This is a podcast dedicated to fire ecology and management within the Natural Resource University podcast network. My name is Dr. Marcus Lashley. I'm a wildlife biologist, an assistant professor of disturbance ecology at the University of Florida, and a lifelong hunter that's passionate about wildlife conservation and management. In this podcast, I will interview scientists and professionals not only on the latest research in fire ecology, but also about their experiences in hopes that you as the listeners can learn why fire ecology is important and also how you can use it to meet your natural resource management goals. So let's get to the burning questions in Fire University. Hey everybody, welcome back to Fire University. Today I have a real treat for you. I actually got to travel back to Tennessee to meet with some old lab mates and my former advisor, Craig Harper. We all got together to go hunting, and it was really special because we're talking about burning in Upland Hardwoods, and we're literally at the site where I first learned how to burn in Upland Hardwoods for wildlife. So hope you appreciate this content as much as we enjoyed recording it. All right, so welcome back to Fire University. Today we have a special treat because I'm here in Tennessee with a whole cohort of students from the Craig Harper lab. We all got our masters here in this lab, and it's a pretty special place for a lot of us because many of the practices that we talk about on the show, we all learned in the same lab coming up here with our studies with Craig. So pretty glad to have everybody here. So we have Craig Harper sitting here with me. Also, John Gruchy is sitting here. How long have you been coming here, John?
Since 2003.
2003, yeah. So, yeah. And then Jordan Nanney is here. How long have you been?
My first year was 2013.
2013, so even a decade right there. That's pretty cool. You know, the legacy that I feel like that is being created. There are not many labs, you know, where we're getting trained and people literally know students that went through the same lab from a decade in between. So that's pretty cool. I was in the middle of that. I've been coming since 2007. So pretty cool experience to be involved in that. But yeah, today we want to talk about burning in hardwoods, which I think is kind of a special time because many of us, including me, actually burned in hardwoods for the first time right here where we're at on this property. So pretty interesting to bring that all back together and to sit down with some old friends and talk about this with everybody. So the age-old question, should you burn in your hardwoods?
Well, if you're asking me, if you're wanting to manage your hardwoods for deer and turkeys in particular, you certainly can. You're not going to hurt anything. You can help a lot.
I think especially on this property, just think, especially for you, John, but even for me, I've been coming a little over a decade, and the way that this property has changed over that decade is just incredible.
I think from my perspective, I think the most, I'm a private lands biologist, and we tend to answer almost every question the same. When people ask us something, I would say it depends.
Yeah. And
so obviously it depends. We probably aren't going to talk about fire in a water and willow flat or a cherry bark woods or something like that. But you've got a dry upland hardwood that facilitates fire, that's got fire adapted species in that plant community.
Mm-hmm.
I think there's a lot of good that can be had from a deer and turkey and from a non-game wildlife from a lot of those angles using prescribed fire.
Yeah, I think those are good points. And you also reminded me, the listeners probably like to know what everybody does. These guys, around me all have an immense amount of experience working, particularly with private landowners, implementing fire, and a lot of that in upland hardwoods even. So quite a bit of experience. So John mentioned a private lands biologist in Mississippi, and you've been in that a little over a decade, right?
Yeah, 2007, and I coordinate the statewide program.
Yeah, coordinate the program. So now you're overseeing several private lands biologists, and I'd say a fair amount of what you talk about is burning with those landowners, right?
That's a great deal of it. It's usually fire or water. We're usually managing uplands or wetlands.
Yeah, there you go. So Jordan, you want to talk a little bit about what you're doing right now?
Sure. My role right now is working with the Tennessee Wildlife Resources Agency as one of two supervisory wildlife foresters. We have one on the eastern side of the state and one on the western side. I happen to be located on the western side. Primarily, my role is to work with WMA managers to use timber harvest and other techniques to improve habitat conditions for the focal wildlife species on the forested acres of the wildlife management areas.
So are you generally focusing on game species?
Generally, yes.
Not always, but
deer and turkey are most popular, of course. We've done several timber harvests that are focused more on improving conditions for rabbits. Just recently completed a project in western Tennessee specifically focused at improving habitat quality for swamp rabbits. So kind of a cool job. You get to work in several different geographic conditions, different suites of wildlife species, but deer and turkey, obviously.
Yeah. Well, I think everybody sitting around here probably got into this because of our love for hunting and fishing, and particularly deer and turkey. I know that's what led me into this field to begin with. So it's cool that that's what you get to do now for a living. So, Craig, how long have you been the Extension
Wildlife Specialist since 1998.
1998. And how long have you been working with Tanasi?
Came here for the first time in the fall of 2000. They asked me to come to help them with a deer problem, and that blossomed into all kinds of things. And the most rewarding thing and opportunity that I have had in this job is working with you all, my graduate students, and in particular, not only on your projects, but on this property, which they have allowed us to use essentially as an outdoor classroom for 20 plus years. And so we are able to come and cut and burn and plant and spray and mess up, and it's okay, and learn. And
when you mess up, everybody lets you know about it for the next 2 decades. We haven't stopped listening to the things I've messed up. I know that.
I have pictures of each graduate student with their spray streaks and food plots, and of course that's where a lot of the stuff started with food plots back in the late 90s with the applied research angle. But quickly that turned into more forest management for wildlife, in particular deer and turkeys. And then a lot of concentration on managing early successional communities. And obviously fire has been an integral part of both of those the entire time.
Yeah, and just this morning, getting up on the hillside and seeing the combination of timber harvest and reducing the basal area in those stands paired with fire, it's pretty incredible to see how much that hillside has changed since I first started coming here.
When you're talking about fire and hardwoods, that's when the response to burning really shines, is when you pair dry fire with other habitat.
Yeah, I think that's a good point. Some of the students in your lab before me did a few experiments where they burned under hardwoods, right? It was closed canopy conditions. And then my study was in upland hardwoods, and we had a control treatment, which basically meant, we didn't do anything in the stand. Then we had a fire treatment where we had closed canopy hardwoods and burned underneath. And in both of those studies, we essentially had no effect of fire. I think mine we were looking at production of deer forage in the understory. But with my study, the best I recall, we got a little bit of a response in the second time that we burned it. Or no, it was 2 years after fire. That's right. We had a little bit of a response, but it was vastly dampened, like you were saying. When we reduced the canopy down to about 50% coverage and paired that with fire, all of a sudden we ended up with 8 or 10-fold the deer forage available in the understory. And best I recall, that lasted for 5 or 6, 7 years before we had to burn it.
That's right. But of course, you have to continue to use fire to maintain either forage production or a desired structure in the understory. And then, of course, over the years now, we've got multiple areas where we have closed canopy hardwoods that we have burned many, many times. We have stands that range in the amount of sunlight, which drives the whole thing, from 10 to 20%, some with 30%, some with 50%, some with 80%. And all of those can serve a purpose. So there is no one set fire intensity or fire frequency or fire timing that is good for all objectives. For example, here, we still have a lot of closed canopy hardwood here that we burn periodically under. Now, according to what we want in there, we might have a moderate intensity fire if we're wanting to continue to reduce the amount of sugar maple. But if we don't, and we want to have some stands that are more open and breezy, and they might serve as loafing areas for turkeys during the summertime, for example, and deer also, where it's on the cooler side aspect, a north or east facing aspect, and you leave that canopy largely intact, and 80% plus canopy closure, and you have low intensity fire. You create those open, breezy conditions that can be attractive for different species at different times. And then we have other areas where we might have, and the range, a key range is about 30% sunlight. When you have about 30% sunlight, that's when you start to get that nice response that you're hoping for with regard to forage, as well as structure. Right. And then when you up that to about 50% sunlight, that's when you can, start to get kind of an explosion out of the understory.
Right. That's what I always tell people when I'm, talking to landowners or whatever. The system is light limited first. So if you're burning under a canopy, there's reasons that you might want to do that, like you're saying, but until you've released that resource light to the understory, that's limiting the response to the fire. So it can really augment the effects of both practices by pairing them together.
In some cases, in those closed canopy settings, the species composition has changed a lot because of a lack of fire on those areas. So in some cases, you may need to start off with adjusting the species composition right off the bat so that your treatment of prescribed fire matches.
Yeah, I know I've walked around with the hatchet doing that a little bit.
Well, and also that first burn, sometimes in a closed canopy, you can get a little fuel reduction so that when you start doing manipulations, you don't have that big fuel load. Well, still going to have it, but maybe reduce it a little bit.
Right.
And something else that we've learned here over the years is, of course, you can take a hatchet, or I prefer a small chainsaw, and we can cut or kill the trees that we want dead. So the ones that are remaining are specifically the ones that we want to remain.
Exactly.
But if you don't want to do that, don't have the time or what have you, you can always bump the intensity of the fire up, and that's going to take out some trees.
Right.
And of course, fire should always be used with caution with regard to harming your hardwood overstory, much of which can be very valuable. And you always hear people talk about, well, you can't burn in hardwoods because you'll kill the trees.
Right. I wanted to get to that. Yeah.
And that's patently false. You can kill the trees, but I've seen many a pine stand that were killed also because the intensity of the fire was too hot, and the firing technique and the timing was not correct.
The fire can kill the hardwoods, but it doesn't necessarily kill the hardwoods.
Well, one of the things that brought that to my mind is when John mentioned, especially when you burn a stand for the first time and you have on average, about 5 to 7 years of leaf litter that's essentially built up before it's becoming, duff material.
Mm-hmm.
And so you've got more fine fuels then than, most times after you've begun burning a stand with some regularity. And the other thing that can cause some damage to trees, of course, is large debris at the bottoms of the trees.
Sure. Which, if we're doing what we're talking about, manipulating composition, that might be a little more of a problem up front, where you have, a lot of dead trees laying around that you're intentionally getting rid of. So you can take a little bit of care. So I did before the episode, I did a little bit of a literature review to see what is actually in the literature on that. How much volume of timber are we actually losing by burning repeatedly in upland hardwood stands? And of course, there are a few studies. Some of them have dozens of sites in many states. So they're pretty large scale upland hardwood forests, southern Appalachian, also central hardwoods region studies. And of course, the managers are different, so there's varying fire intensities and things being used. But I was pretty surprised that even when they were repeatedly burning for decades, we were still talking about a pretty minor part of the volume being lost in terms of damaging the trees that you might want to go in and harvest. So we're talking about, on average, across the studies, about 3% over a 2-decade period was being lost. And most of that is in non-oak species, and particularly your white oaks. You almost lose nothing, even when you're looking at that scale. Now, can you harm your trees? Absolutely. What you were talking about earlier, Craig, if you've got a stand that is your really high quality stand that you're prepping to cut, that's probably not the stand that you're going to target to be burning, because your objective is different with that. But you don't necessarily have to damage your valuable trees to manage it for wildlife.
No, and it always goes back to your objective. If your objective is to improve forage for deer, improve fawning cover for deer, improve structure for nesting and for brooding for wild turkeys, increase the amount of forbs, increase the amount of insects for turkeys and other species, absolutely you would want to use fire. It's going to get you to where you want to go. Right. Otherwise, it's going to be much more difficult, and your ability to reach your objective is going to be limited if you cannot or do not use fire.
And working with private landowners, there's a wide range of initial conditions to a lot of these stands.
Mm-hmm.
A lot of the landowners that I'm working with that are using prescribed fire extensively, the timber stand had already been pretty well high graded on the front end, and there wasn't really anything left but cross ties in that stand anyhow. So the idea of losing value in that stand had already, that ship had kind of already sailed. So they're able to do a whole lot more different fire regimes there.
Well, as an example, if you took pictures or video, all of these hardwood stands on this property has been burned with some regularity now for 20 years.
Yeah. And there's still lots of oaks standing in there that look beautiful.
Absolutely.
I rolled down the hill a few times today in some of those stands where the acorns are all over the ground.
Right.
So
I don't even have to step on acorns to roll down the hills.
Well, they are pretty steep now.
Being from Mississippi,
The bad thing is when you're holding a drip torch and you're rolling down the hill, then it gets a little bit rough on you.
An important point to maybe make right now would be, if you're going to treat a large area, when I say large, I mean 15 acres plus, something that could be commercially valuable in the initial thinning treatment, if you're trying to get sunlight to combine with your prescribed burning. You need to be sure to work with your consulting forester, if you're doing it yourself, to make sure it's in the contract not to leave tops piled up near adjacent to the boles of the trees, and to take special care not to scar the bottom bowl of the tree by dragging or running over it with a skidder tire, because that increases the likelihood of damaging a tree from fire.
Well, and, I've seen plenty of stands where exactly that. You've already got trees from your harvest. Nobody really seems to worry about that as much, where you've damaged some trees, and then we damage potentially even fewer with the fire, and people, get bent out of shape about it. But another thing to think about, if you have a couple of trees, like, we all have our stands in the place on that really nice white oak that rains it down every year. You don't want to damage that tree. It's pretty easy to take precautions to make sure that tree is safe, even if something, went awry. So,
a lot of that has to do also with your scale of management.
Right.
So Jordan mentioned, a 15 acre or so stand. If I'm managing a property specifically for deer and turkeys, I don't want to manage stands larger than about 15 to 20 acres
right.
in any particular fashion.
Mm-hmm.
You're going to get much more usability both by turkeys and by deer when you have more management units that are
right.
smaller, say, 10 to 20 acres,
mm-hmm.
than trying to manage a 40 or 50 acre stand, or especially sure. larger, all the same way. And another interesting point related to intensity and damage in trees, as you know, for the past 15 years, we have been using fire a lot during the latter part of the growing season,
mm-hmm.
especially August through October. And during that time, my gosh, you're usually challenged to get the stand to burn.
right.
It's not burning too hot. You're just challenged to get it to burn. And, you're frustrated because it's kind of smoldering around and the flame length's literally,
mm-hmm.
or, 3 to 6 inches or something like that. And not all of the stand burns.
right.
A lot of times you might only get 60 to 80%
mm-hmm.
of the stand that actually burns.
Right.
And there are a vast majority of burns. I mean, there's zero damage to the overstory trees.
Unless something, a log or something laying around on the ground catches on fire.
And that's the other point. If you can't walk around and kind of peruse through 10 to 15 acres prior to burning, well, you're not enjoying your time in the woods. There's nothing
mm-hmm.
wrong there anyway. So, we're always, you check your fire breaks and,
right.
You're looking at the area. Well, if there's some log or large debris next to the bole of the tree, well, take your foot or your hand or a small saw if needed,
right.
and move it 3 or 4 feet away, and then
mm-hmm.
you're good.
Yeah.
In those when you're using those late growing season fires, you mentioned the flame heights only being 3 to 6 inches. Is that only because we're using firing techniques that limit that? Or in some cases, I've noticed if I'm using a strip head fire, because I have to actually get it to burn, the flame heights are still relatively suppressed.
That's exactly right. And it's also got to do with how much canopy you have.
Yeah, that's what I was going to say. How much light are you getting?
Unless you have a minimum of 30% sunlight coming into the stand, you're going to have a minimum of 3 to 5, and really 6 to 8 mile an hour wind is better just to get the fire to carry. And hardly ever can you get it
mm-hmm.
to just back through a stand during that time of year. You're going to have to use some wind, because the dampening effect of shade
mm-hmm.
in these hardwood stands is unbelievable. I mean, as
really
soon
is.
as it hits a shaded spot, or if you're not burning on a bluebird day and clouds come over, the fire just whooshes right out.
Yep.
Yeah. And also our relative humidities that time of year are much higher. If we
mm-hmm.
get into February, March timeframe when most people want to burn, that's when you've got your 20% relative humidities with 15 mile an hour winds, and you can probably burn some things up in those conditions.
And that's exactly right. It's more, quote, dangerous with regard to intensity in February and March when you have full solar radiation reaching the forest floor.
And it's right after all your fuel, it's just at the ground.
And all of the understory is green. Well,
mm-hmm.
that green is 80% water. And
mm-hmm.
so that dampens so much of the energy out of the fire just to vaporize that water before the material is consumed. And then much of the material is not consumed.
Right.
And you think, gosh, I haven't hardly done anything. We come back next day and a lot of that's browned out just because of the heat, but it didn't consume it.
Well, and really, if we're thinking about from a habitat standpoint for wildlife, having that variability within the stand is it's a good thing. To have that variability in structure. You don't necessarily, even if you're only burning 10 or 15 acres, want every square inch of it to burn up. I mean, It's okay for there to be some patches in there that don't.
You may have little finger diameter sized sprouts and saplings that are, 3 to 8 feet tall. And after the fire, the structure is virtually identical as it was before the fire. It's just that those stems have at least been top killed, but that visibility still is limited, and that can be very desirable for different species.
Right quick, I want to jump back because the take home I was trying to get at right there.
Oh, did you not give us a take home?
No, it's in there, but it's not direct.
Yeah.
Do not expect to use the same firing technique in the late growing season as you're using in the dormant season or the early growing season, because the conditions are very different, weather-wise and fuel-wise. So keep that in mind if you are planning on implementing some of these practices.
To sort of marry a couple of things together. So what you're talking about, and I think it was Craig that said something earlier, when we're talking about objectives, the timing can be changed. It's going to change how you implement the fire, but the timing can also be changed to, target different objectives. And on what you're trying to do in the plant community. Another couple of the students that worked in my lab on some of these things have looked at the late growing season fires on up into September, and we were showing that, a really big increase in the number of bow shots you'd get in that stand right after you've burned, if you do it right before bow season comes in. Another really cool study, we actually went in and burned acorns that were laying around on the ground and compared the wildlife selection of acorns that had been burned versus acorns that had not been burned. And I'm going to tell you what, a deer and a turkey will eat a cooked acorn over an uncooked one. They'll even eat the species they don't normally select highly over the highly selected ones when they've been burned, which is pretty interesting.
Marcus, you're always coming up with these terms. I think you could come up with a term better than cooked acorns. Roasted. Maybe roasted or something like that.
However you want to say it.
Your mineral sprouts or mineral stumps. I mean, we've made these stumps for years and years, and Marcus comes up with or Bronson, whoever, comes up with the term, and all of a sudden mineral stumps.
Hey, we just want people to use these practices. We're not trying to sell anything but good information. Right?
How many people are about to fill a 5-gallon bucket full of acorns to go home
and roast them?
And go from that
That is not what I was getting at there. You can do it at a much larger scale for a much lower price to just go burn it right after they fall off.
I guarantee you one thing, they'll eat a roasted acorn before they will a fertilized one, because a fertilized one doesn't change it one iota.
That's exactly right. I know every one of us counted tens of thousands of acorns to show that fertilizing them doesn't mean anything. But releasing the canopy does, which is another point, that we can talk about at some point is, when you are thinning these stands, if you do it tactfully, you can potentially even increase mass production while you're reducing tree canopy.
Before y'all got here, Bonner and I and Mark, of course, we're doing all the work before y'all show up. We're walking around and we're finding, what we call the acorn trees, the ones that actually are producing the acorns.
Yeah.
And, guess what we're doing? We essentially know what they are now, but, we're setting up stand sites and everything else according to where the trees that produce are. It is remarkable when you start walking around in the woods and paying attention to which individual trees, and it doesn't matter whether it's a white oak or northern red oak or scarlet or what have you, which individual trees are the ones that produce. And they are the ones that consistently produce during the good acorn years. Now, there are going to be poor years in which, few to none of them produce anything. Right. But during the good acorn years, it's those individuals that are producing acorns. And when you find those, you can easily then, if you're burning, go around and check around those trees at least if there's debris or something. So at least you have a good idea. You begin to learn your stands like you know your bedroom. You got to get up in the middle of the night to go use the bathroom. You don't have to turn on the light to get into the bathroom. You can literally navigate your woodlots or stands in the same manner and know where these individual trees are.
And just as an example from my own personal experience, I grew up hunting in Alabama on family land, and we had about a 50-acre timber harvest of oak, and we went in and marked every single good producer to leave it during that harvest, and I knew all of them by heart. I knew every single tree on 50 acres, which ones we're going to keep and which ones we don't. And we ended up with probably 5 to 10 trees per acre that we retained in that harvest because of it.
If you don't want to treat an entire stand with regard to canopy reduction, then at least you can go to those individual trees that are the good acorn producers and exercise, a crop tree release, if you will, where you're allowing those individual trees to at least increase their crown size. Right. And then they're going to increase their acorn production, both within the existing crown because of an increased stem density, but also as the crown gets larger, you have another increase there because the tree has a larger crown in which to produce, a larger diameter crown in which to produce acorn.
But fertilizing it.
Fertilizing is not, if it helped, hey, I would be the first one to shout it from the rooftop. I don't get any money from whether you fertilize or not. But it doesn't work. So
yeah, it definitely did not work. On a 10-year study with 120 oaks right now. Yeah, it didn't work. So we can move on from that one. Another thing that I was thinking about, and I hadn't had the place to go in the segue, is you were talking about the small scale, managing 15-acre stands, and something that I think we've all kind of talked about to some degree, and I've even had some students work on this idea, is like you can burn at really small scales and still have a measurable effect on your hunting experience. For instance, in these stands, when you're burning, it's really attractive to many of the walleye species that we'd be burning for, and they seek that area out even when it's done at less than an acre scale. So there are a couple of things, and I want to get into if a landowner's thinking about burning, how we're going to get into that. And one thing I think is really important, and we probably all agree with, you don't have to start out at a big scale, and you don't necessarily have to be at a really big scale to make a big impact, right? So we're not talking about you having to take your whole 200-acre farm and burn it all in 1 year. That's not what we're talking about at all. Even if you can just carve out a half acre or an acre here to get you started and get you familiar with fire and how to implement it so that you feel safe, you start building some confidence, and then we can even start scaling up.
So you're right. Something that I've found people that clicks with people when we're doing field days and training workshops and whatnot, and actually we'll be outside implementing fire, and I'll show them some small demonstration that might be a quarter of an acre that we're burning just for demonstration, and say, well, what good's that going to do? And I'll ask them, well, how many of y'all deer hunt or turkey hunt? And then I'll ask, well, what's the smallest food plot that you have ever planted and you killed a deer in? All of a sudden, their eyebrows raise and the light bulb goes up, thinking, that's exactly right. You don't have to burn an entire stand. You literally can have a backpack blower on your back and,
especially in a hardwood stand like
blow
this.
A break around, a quarter of an acre or a half acre or whatever, and just burn a little small patch. And along those lines, this is something that I've told people they might want to try if they've never burned and they're hesitant to. If you take a blower and blow a small, just a small fire break around literally a 10 by 10 foot area, and go out there during all of the seasons and during different conditions, maybe the humidity is 60% or 40% or 30%, and see if it will burn. Yeah. Just to see if it will burn. And as
take note of the conditions and see how it behaves.
You begin to see what the fire behavior is when you're burning under different conditions. You don't have to practice by burning an entire stand. Right. You can practice and learn by burning, little bitty, 10 or 20 by 20 foot areas in the woods.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. So let's let that segue us into, what does a landowner need to do if they haven't been using fire but they'd like to?
I was going to say some stuff about implementation on that as well. So keep in mind, there are several different ways that landowners get into this, and some landowners will never be comfortable enough to burn their own property, and they're going to have to contract somebody. So if you are contracting a prescribed burn manager, you do small blocks, they're going to have a fixed cost, and so they may charge more for small blocks on a per acre basis. That's just something you need to kind of work out and be prepared for. Hopefully, most people can become familiar and do some of those small blocks and kind of some of those layup burns, if you will, themselves. And if they are not comfortable with some of the more different fuel loads and all, maybe contracting those out. But in general, the first step is going to be trying to consult or contract or work with a professional, whether that's a consultant forester like Jordan was talking about earlier, or a private lands biologist with the State Fish and Game Agency, getting somebody out there and getting acquainted with the local regulations and laws, because most states have every state has different laws with regards to prescribed fire. You want to make sure you're inside those laws. So becoming familiar with that first, and then developing a plan and making sure that you have enough staffing and that your weather variables are within your plan. Again, following all those laws and making sure you've got trained people that you can bounce ideas off of.
Right. And then getting a little practice.
Yeah.
Burn a 10-yard by 10-yard square and learn a lot about what you're doing that.
I do that commonly, and it's fun. You
go out in your backyard.
Just by your personal experience.
Yeah. You go out in your backyard all the time and do that, don't you? Yeah.
Yeah, you can't burn my wood lot.
Is that because there's
not
no
enough fuel back there to burn my wood lot.
Yeah. That's good. So, all right. Well, I appreciate everybody. I think that that was a pretty good talk there. Hopefully, everybody learned a lot. I know I certainly learned something every time I talk to you all about this stuff. So, a lot of fun to getting out there burning, getting involved in habitat management, and then seeing, especially like we have here, how that transforms the property and the experience and all the things that go with that. All right. Well, thanks everybody for listening in, and we'll talk to you next time. Fire University is part of the Natural Resource University podcast network, funded by the Renewable Resources Extension Act. If you like what you heard today in this episode, please follow us on all the social media platforms at UF Deer Lab.
Natural Resources University is funded by the Renewable Resources Extension Act. New episodes are released every Tuesday. For more information, follow us on our social media platforms at NR_University.